Welcome back, everyone. Now that we've talked about those being skills of coaching, we're going to now turn our attention to the doing skills that make coaching more powerful. So the first doing skill is active listening, and let's continue on with that next. Active listening is the silencing of your own voice in your head, or that inner dialogue, which could really easily be subject to or influenced by the coach's own agenda or having the coach's own prescription influence an interaction. If we're really listening to someone, we're not necessarily coming back with, well, okay, you need to do this. Because if you're truly listening, you're not thinking ahead to what you're going to say or how you're going to reply. We can't really be listening to someone if we're preforming our responses, and the bullet points that follow are meant to be just ways to summarize how coaches need to know about active listening. Within the dynamics of holistic coaching, if you engage in self-reflection with a client, it's likely that you'll come to see active listening as one of your most relevant and useful tools and skills, because it's also a performance indicator of the coach's skill. For example, how well do you listen, and are you able to relax? What if a coach was worried about how an interaction would go? It would make it hard for the coach to be able to listen and let conversations flow to a point where you're able to get the client to relax and where you can both feel more comfortable. But this will show when you're doing it right, when your interactions don't make a coach worry about what they're going to say. And it will also show your experience level if you're able to practice active listening without really having to make an effort to do it. So it will feel more natural to both parties. Furthermore, most coaches will get a boost in confidence when they're responding to clients with more experience after having mastered active listening as a really important doing skill. A lot of what we listen for is actually positive thinking, and as coaches we use motivational or appreciative inquiry to maximize so much of our client interactions and to learn about the whole client that we refer to. And isn't that why we're holistic coaches after all? We want to reflect back anytime we hear positive thoughts. So something along the lines of, oh, you seem really positive about that, is a simple reflection that we can say back to a client. And you don't want to miss any opportunity to recognize a positive thought or an opportunity to encourage a client. Or if the client seems really peaceful about something, for example, stating something such as, you seem really comfortable about your decision. In this way, you're able to assess the client's comfort level. Positive emotions are important because they energize our client, and these are the emotions we want to reflect back to the client and shine light on their relationship to change. A coach might sense frustration or worry, and this type of client can be eased into conversation with a simple reflection that reflects back to the client what you've heard. Something like, you seem like you're really frustrated about this, is a form of active listening that confronts negative talk from the client. Simple lines can be used to reflect. Sometimes coaches will hear even ambivalence. Sometimes those people will seem to not be leaning one way or another during a coaching interaction. Try stating, it sounds like you haven't really made up your mind about this yet, and what does that mean? That might be a great way to counter negativity coming from a client during an interaction. But regardless of good or bad, positive or negative, all that is heard coming from the client should be reflected back to the client. Again, these emotions are important, both positive and negative, because they too can instigate change, and they can tell us something about what might be getting in our client's way. Think about how well you listen, and if you had to rate your listening on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you put yourself? What helps us to be better listeners, and what are the conditions that make us a better listener? Reflect on your own abilities tied to coaching and active listening, and I want you to just think about how well you listen. So think about your background as a coach and how you've listened to your clients before, and maybe reflect on some of these experiences from the past and think of some of your previous success stories with clients. Other factors contribute to our listening as well, such as personality. And even though we're often being put on a pedestal by our client, we have the same stress of life and all of the chaos of everyday living just like everyone else, and we have to be mindful of being careful not to let this trickle into our interactions and affect our listening. So maintaining good, strong eye contact and using reflections are just good ways to actively listen to our client. But it's all about learning that time when you know that you're doing your best work. And it's best to know when you're at a personal best so that you can always get into this mindset each time you interact with the client. So what is the coach doing in this capacity, and what is the role, or what is your role as a coach during an interaction? So we know that you're not here to fix the client, but you should lead and support along the way. This can be hard when we hear negative self-talk coming from a client. For this example, let's say that the coach is hearing some disappointment and frustration from their client and then feels it's best to tap into her tuition by being curious. So now we're both doing and being different things at the same time for this client. Maybe the coach will come to feel with intuition that the client will be drained of energy by the failure of last week and that they might give up. And the coach is also using more intuition by thinking that the client may not do well in the next week if they're showing signs of being negatively affected by a lack of results for whatever the reason. So this is an example of active listening that's kind of loaded up with everything. It has a reflection, it uses empathy followed by some curiosity, and then comes back with an inquiry. And your tone should seem as natural as this with a client. While it's true that we're spending a lot of time being curious in the beginning of a new relationship with a client, it eventually comes to be time to answer the question, what do we do with all that we've learned about our client, both the positive and the negative? So we might have heard frustration, or maybe the strategies or prescriptions that we're talking about aren't right, or maybe it's just not the right time for the client. When you hear excitement, though, if you hear happiness and joy, for instance, picture a client telling you about their grandkids. The energy level may pick up and you will both feel this positive energy. But what's the first thing that we do with this positive energy? We want to reflect back what we hear as something like, you look and sound so excited about your grandkids. So we're beginning to identify positive talk with our client. When we're experienced using our intuition and when we're comfortable at it, we are going to get to a point when we hear something potentially important and we're going to need to use more of our intuition to see if what's being shared is something that we might need to dig in deeper at. And you can see some examples of internal dialogue here to use based on your intuition. And it's really simple. Try something like, I'm getting this visual or this picture. Can I share it with you? This is an example of using your intuition to, in this way, confirm something. Let's move on now to learn more about reflections. We have 6 kinds of reflections that you'll see here: simple, double-sided, clarifying, summarizing, metaphor, and meta-view. And let's compare how we can use them in our client interactions. Before we get into specifics, there are some quick informal reflections that we should also acknowledge because we provide them almost constantly. So we will use what we're going to refer to as a quick reflection pretty readily when we're just agreeing with someone or expressing an understanding of things that are being communicated to us. So a quick I see or a similar reflection is probably the most common. But now let's look at those simple reflections. With simple reflections, the coach is just simply restating what the client has said. Here our client states, losing weight is hard for me, but I really want to do it. And the coach then reflects back stating, sounds like you want to do the hard work. The best part about a simple reflection is that if coaches find themselves stuck in conversations, it's all right because you can just repeat back exactly what's been said. So something like, oh, you really want to lose the weight. Now let's take the statement that's been shared from the client and switch the wording around just a little bit to help you recognize when you hear negative emotions that are coming from a client. So in the first way, we could say, losing weight is hard for me, but I really want to do it. And then compare it to the same thing being said with a negative tone. I really want to lose weight, but it's so hard for me. So we have a qualifier in the statement. A double-sided reflection can be used by the coach to help identify any conflicting messages that might come from your client. So a coach might hear differences in what's being said. Again, consider the example before you. On one hand, they acknowledge that it's hard to lose weight, but they're positive about making a change, whereas the other statement is focusing more on the negative aspects of changing a behavior. The coach has reflected back this, but in a different way. Or you might say, so you really want to lose the weight, but you know it will be hard work. It's like a restatement in this way. We reflected for the first client sample by stating, sounds like you're willing to do the hard work to lose the weight. How can we reflect now for this client? So think again back to what's being heard in these statements. And the same words are being used, but the meanings being different. In the first example, the person saying that they want to do it. The obstacle had been a qualifier, but the client's now showing that this has been handled as a decision and that they're ready to do something. In the second statement, though, they're still leaning toward the more negative, and the qualifier is sorted out for us here as the but part of the statement. So the person may be more focused on the negative part, and this is probably someone who might not be ready to go further with a change effort or coaching. It's also important to rely on your coaching intuitions to determine where you go next in terms of dialogue with this type of client. Here's another good example of a double-sided reflection. Now read the dialogue and notice how simple this act of good coaching can be. Again, a double-sided reflection is the application of a coaching doing skill and involves reflecting back any contradictory elements or statements contained in what you're hearing or what's being stated from the client. But still, you're simply summarizing back what's been heard. The next reflection is clarifying, and just as your client is communicating with you, you want to confirm that you're hearing things right. So statements like, do I understand you correctly, or do I have this right, would be good follow-up examples of reflections that are clarifying with the client. Try to have different ways to do clarifications with your clients. Avoid using the same statements repeatedly because clients will then be able to start to predict your next comments. Another example would be a coach stating, all right, this is what I'm hearing from you so far. You know that you want to lose weight, but you know that the exercise part is going to be hard for you. Now in this way, the coach is using a different set of words to still draw a response and get clarification from their client. The coach has also used another type of reflection, a summary. So summary and clarification reflections are similar in a couple of ways. The next two types of reflections are metaphor and meta-view. Now, a metaphor reflection relies on imagery to be able to convey a message, and so there's a strong visualization element to it. Here we provide a sample. Our coach might say, I'm getting a picture of something that I'd like to share with you, and what I'm seeing is that it's like you're standing at the edge of a jagged cliff, and if you're not able to take control of your stability while you work toward successfully hitting your goal, how hard might you fall? And this is an example of a metaphor. A meta-view reflection is a little different in that it requires vision to be clear and accessible for the client, and this reflection is one that pulls everything together and then provides perspective. An example using the same jagged cliff would be, I'm wondering, if you could have an aerial view, does this challenge seem any different than the one that you faced before when you resigned from your job? That's an example of using a meta-view reflection with a client. So at this point, we're exploring different possibilities for our clients, and we're being curious about them, and we're looking at change efforts with them, and we're reflecting back to the client what we've heard. But you'll eventually come to a point where you'll look to wrap up your interaction and summarize with some of your own perspective. Maybe this is a perspective that's now been influenced by some intuition and some experience because you're more aware of that. And within this perspective is your summary of what you've reflected back to clarify and build rapport and gain trust, and to also get your client's motives and goals uncovered. So there's a whole lot to consider during these times that the coach is involved in active listening. And in review, the meta view is that big picture item for your client. And this involves what we call a positioning statement, like where are you in the stage of this change? What's your position in this change? And this will also include the client's vision. So you as the coach will have to consider if or how this will relate to the client's meta view or overall desired outcome. Another really great way to use a meta view reflection is to encourage your client to pull back and look at everything from a higher perspective or a bird's eye view. In this way, the client would hopefully, using visualization, see all that's before them in a way that's unique, and this would be their own perspective and not any of those that might be coming from their coach. So this is especially useful when a client is leaning more toward negative thinking or negative talk. A coach can be summarizing positive changes for this client to keep them on track with their change efforts, or even brainstorm ideas to plan future change efforts. Read through these coach sample reflections and see how many you can identify from the list of types that we described. We have simple, double-sided, clarifying, summarizing, metaphor, and meta view. We've learned some doing skills and some being skills and how to reflect and even how to apply the trans-theoretical model. But when you're coaching, how will you know if you're doing these core competencies of coaching in the right way? One way would be to consider those times when you experience some of the bullet points that are listed before you. So in a way, it all comes together. You're listening carefully and you're directing the conversation appropriately. And we do this with inquiry and intuition. So something like, "This is what I'm hearing. Is that correct for you?" would be an appropriate summary reflection from a coach. Now we can perhaps direct a client to focus on a particular topic. The client will really be the one doing all the work. You'll find that usually the client demonstrates that they have enough knowledge about their situation to compel them toward changing a behavior, and we don't want to have to sell a client on behavior change. We don't need to say things like, "Oh, come on, you know that if you don't quit smoking, you'll take at least 10 years off your life," because the client probably already knows this. But we want them to actually say these things. We also would not want to come off as being the expert or using that expert approach. There are some warning signs for coaches to avoid, such as letting our own personal perspectives filter into our interactions. This can prevent our ability to be a good listener. As an example, if we go into a coaching interaction or relationship with the mindset of, "This person ought to change," or "What is wrong with them?" it's also not good for helping clients move through behavior change. Or even if the client's not thinking about any obvious items that you might see, they might be managing other things in their life and they can't commit to making major changes at this time. So something else might have their focus or attention. It doesn't necessarily imply that a client is ignoring their health or maybe in denial. Another red flag for coaches is thinking that health is always the prime motivator or motivating factor for change. It might be, but it's not always. We've spent a lot of time discussing how to be a good coach and what to do, and what we're really doing is building a path for the coach to be able to better understand those holistic needs of your client. And this only happens when we get to know them really well and when we can get them to be both honest and open with us. And that means that we've got to set the stage and maybe lead them into conversation and then provide direction when they ask for it. When you combine the 5 stages of change that are described in your manual with these doing and being skills, this becomes the backbone of a professional coaching presence with core competencies as a guide or frame to work from.